Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, where I, Margarita Mooney Suarez, the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation, will have a conversation with the Catholic iconographer, David Clayton. Before we get started, let me just say a word about the webinar series that this is a part of. Scala is a nonprofit that was founded in 2016 that aims to revitalize American culture through liberal arts education with a keen attention to the integration of beauty, truth, and goodness. Scala began as a series of reading groups and an intensive summer program on the history of education. It has grown to include conferences, faculty seminars, and a webinar series. Scala's first webinar series, called The Love of Learning, was published. Actually, the dialogues, the conversations were so rich that I transcribed and edited them and produced a book called The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts. And one thing I discovered was that dialogue itself is a form of intellectual engagement. So the second round of interviews, the second round of dialogues of which this forms a part, is called Educating for Beauty and Wisdom. You can find all of Scala's past webinars on our YouTube channel, and this webinar is also going to be included and posted there. We have interviewed people such as James Matthew Wilson, a poet and philosopher, Sister Noella Marcelino, a Benedict nun who has a PhD in microbiology, and many other interesting people. Now, today I bring to you David Clayton. David is a native of England, where he studied natural sciences at Oxford University. We're going to hear about his journey from studying natural sciences at Oxford to becoming an iconographer. David has resided in the United States for around the past 12 years, where he has held a position as an artist in residence at St. Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts. And more recently, he began several programs through Pontifex University, a Catholic theology program that offers graduate degrees in theology, Catholic school administration, and sacred art. So I encourage you, if you've not heard of Pontifex before, to check out their programs. Professor Clayton himself teaches classes on the history of sacred images, more generally on art history, and on sacred art specifically. The class that he taught at St. Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts was a class called The Way of Beauty. Professor Clayton has maintained a blog with that same title, The Way of Beauty, for quite some time, and one of his books is entitled The Way of Beauty. Most of our discussion today is going to focus precisely on the theological, philosophical, pedagogical, artistic approach to the Way of Beauty. But I do want to mention that Professor Clayton has authored numerous other books. One of his bestsellers is called The Little Oratory, and it's a book that gives advice on how to decorate your home with sacred art. As I prepared to do this webinar and I heard from people who were registering, turns out a lot of people know Professor Clayton for that book. So please do check it out. He's also written a book of spiritual formation called The Vision for You. And he's written a book on how to paint the human figure. So what I find exciting about today's webinar is that Scala gets to host what we call, in our terms, a culture creator. Scala cares about ideas that can reform culture, and we want to approach those ideas by talking about people, writers, artists, painters, musicians, who build cultural objects that we all get to enjoy. So I like to say that Professor Clayton makes beautiful things and I buy them, or I try to. Most of us are consumers of culture, but we want to hear from culture creators. And the people joining us today are coming from all over the United States as well as abroad. This event is being generously co-sponsored by the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. If you haven't read their journal or participated in one of their activities, I encourage you to follow them and follow their director, Tim O'Malley, on social media to learn about the programs that they offer. Scala hopes to become a hub, a nexus where educators, culture creators, students, and concerned citizens who want to rebuild culture can come together and have these kinds of conversations. So thank you very much for being with us today, Professor Clayton.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, so my first question is, I think a lot of our interviewers are probably thinking what I thought. You know, I have the stereotype of an artist as being, for lack of a better word, artsy fartsy, not a scientist. Can you tell us how you went from studying natural sciences at Oxford to becoming an iconographer?
Yes, so I'd always enjoyed art. And when I was at high school, I was discouraged from doing it, really. I sort of doggedly pursued it. So this would be painting and drawing. And they always pushed me into more academic pursuits. And I was pretty good at science. So I ended up going to university and studying that. But always thought that I'd like to paint and couldn't really work out how to do it. And I thought really I'd missed my chance. I thought you had to go to art school. And that's where you learn to paint. I realize now it's a blessing that I didn't go to art school, because for the most part, they stop you painting and put a video camera in your hand or something like that. They wouldn't, most of them don't teach the sort of painting I'd be interested in. So I studied sciences. I went on and did a master's degree in the US, actually, and came back to England, and then had a sort of crisis. I was very depressed. I didn't know what I wanted to do in life, probably drinking too much, and without direction. And by chance, I met somebody who was helping a friend of mine called David Birtwistle. He's no longer alive. He was pretty elderly at that stage. But he said, I think I've got a way of showing you how to be the person you want to be. And he said, he asked me this question: what would you, if you inherited so much money, it was £1 million in those days, it wouldn't work now, but anyway, so much money that you never had to work again for the money, what would you choose to do? And I said, I'd be an artist. And he said, well, that's what you should do. I'll help you. And so I jumped in, and I'd seen the effect that his direction had had on my friend. And what I didn't realize was that he was giving me a series of spiritual exercises. And I didn't have to be a believer. I was a pretty cynical, sour-minded atheist at the time. If I took delight in anything, it was persuading people who were happy that they were wrong. That's the sort of person I was. But he, with the promise of becoming an artist and really believing him because of his conviction, I allowed him to direct me. And he gave me a sort of Pascal's wager. I didn't realize that's what he was doing, but he said, he gave me a list of a daily routine, which involved prayer and meditation. He didn't call it that, but that's what it was. And trying to lead a good life as an introduction to this. And he said, try this for 30 days, and if you don't like it, we'll return your misery with interest. And so I tried it, and I felt different. And he said, you don't have to believe that God exists. You just need to be willing to believe that he might, and take the actions that are in accordance with this. And so that was the sort of Pascal bit, where he said, basically, try the experiment of God. I'm paraphrasing this. And that's what David presented to me. And I felt a change. And from that beginning, he took me through a process of quite deep reflection, rather like an Ignatian process. It wasn't that, but it was similar. And what I didn't realize is that was the gift that he was giving me. It wasn't so much the opportunity to become an artist, although I eventually became one, having felt that I had no chance. It was what his assumption was, that I needed to make a connection with God, discover God, and then I would discover the calling, God's calling for me. And once I discovered that, then the path would open up in front of me. He just said, you just do one little step at a time in the direction of this great goal that you have. And as long as it's consistent with a good life and a life that is pursuing God, then there's no reason to believe that it won't come true. What he said is that even if I don't become an artist, the only reason I won't become an artist, he said, is if I discover that I'm meant to be doing something even better along the way that is beyond my imagination. Now, he had a way of saying this that made you believe it. And he just said, just try it and see. And as I started to follow this process, my outlook changed. I developed a faith in God. What I didn't know was that he was a firm Catholic. And when I started to look at religion, he said, why don't you try this church here? And he directed me to a building in London that happened to be the Brompton Oratory. And I remember him saying to me, make sure, when you go, make sure you go at 11 o'clock. And then we had a conversation. And I said goodbye to him. He said, oh yeah, just to come back to that point, make sure you go at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And he was directing me to solemn mass at the Brompton Oratory. And he knew that the beauty of this is the most wonderful choir singing chant and polyphony, perhaps still one of the most beautiful experiences I've had, I think, wandering into that church for the first time. And he knew that this would draw me to God. And so that's how I developed a faith. Ultimately, I became a Catholic. There's a lot more to tell along the way, obviously. And I wanted to contribute to this by being an artist. And I think that what David did, he gave me the courage to chase it, to believe that if it was meant to be, it could happen. It just seemed impossible before I met him. And it really happened very much as he said, that bit by bit, I followed this journey, which was a joy along the way, by the way. The journey itself was steadily more joyful. And I became this artist. And that's how it happened. But the greatest gift was before that, and that one was a connection with God. And then beyond that, being received into the church. He was my Catholic sponsor when I was received into the church in London. He never told me he was a Catholic initially. He just promised me that this opportunity to be an artist, because he knew, I think, that I would have run a mile if I'd known that that's what it was leading me to. So in brief, that's my story. It's a journey of faith and courage through that to give it a try, but it's not a mental construct. At some point, I realized that the reason this works, the reason my life is happier, the reason that things seem to be falling into place, or if they don't, I'm better able to deal with them, is because there's a truth that underlies this, and that is that the church is real, and it really is the mystical body of Christ, and that God exists and he loves me.
That's a fascinating story. I work with a lot of young people in their 20s who have degrees from prestigious universities to places similar to Oxford. And a lot of people in their 20s are really seeking their particular vocation, their particular calling, what they're passionate about. And what I heard you say was that in your 20s, you hit some hard times where you didn't really see what the purpose of your life was or what your calling was. And that this mentor encouraged you to name kind of what your intuition, what would you do if you didn't have to have a prestigious degree and earn money to survive? And well, you actually had an answer. It was art, because it had been in your background. And what this mentor helped you to do was to discover your own calling through faith in God. And ultimately, what I hear you saying is that him helping you discover faith in God helped you take the courageous steps to become an artist, which seems like a less secure path in life than being a working scientist or working in finance or doing what people typically do. You just don't see many people today coming out of prestigious schools who want to dedicate their life to art or to music or something. So when you made this courageous decision to become an artist, how did you go about making this transition? How did you get trained as an artist?
Yeah, so the way that David told me to do this practically was to have my sights set on this wonderful goal, the vision for me, but to take it one small practical step at a time. Excuse me. So what he did was he suggested that the very first step was just sign on at the local art school in London. I lived close to Chelsea in London, so that's where I went, and just did life drawing classes. And I remember saying to him, it's going to take me 80 years of evening classes or something to be able to get the training. He said, lad, he always called me lad. It doesn't work like that. If you take this step, then what happens is the next door will open up in front of you and you'll discover your path. You can't say what that path is going to be precisely. And so the way that it worked was that I did a few of these evening classes. There was a teacher there who noticed that I liked to draw in a particular way. And he said, why don't you go down to the National Gallery and have a look at the medieval section there, the National Gallery in London. And if you like the paintings, and he named these artists, I remember one of them was Lorenzo Marco. They paint in a medium called egg tempera. And he said, I think that you would enjoy painting in that because you obviously like to paint faithful to a drawing. And that's the medium that I paint in. Why don't you go and have a look? So I said, this is great. And so I started to try and learn egg tempera. I then didn't know, I found it difficult. It's not an easy medium if you're used to other things. And through a conversation, somebody mentioned to me that they knew a guy who was an Orthodox monk who painted icons. And they said his name was Athanasius Ledwich, which that name will never leave me. It's such a great name. It turns out that Athanasius Ledwich was Father Athanasius Ledwich, who had converted to Orthodoxy from the Anglican Church and had never touched a paintbrush in his life. He got this letter from me and said, I don't know why David Clayton thinks I paint icons. I wrote to him saying, I need some help. Can you help me with egg tempera? But he did know an iconographer, a guy called Aidan Hart, who was a monk. And Aidan Hart wrote to me and said, if you're interested in doing this, I'd be happy to show you. He didn't know me from Adam, but he was generous spirited. And in the end, he became my icon painting teacher. It took a bit of persuasion. I wasn't Orthodox, and it took him a bit of persuasion to get him to do it. But he's someone I'm still in touch with more than 30 years later. So it was connections like that. And this was very, very much as David had described it, that you would, people, doors will open, you just have to walk through them and then worry about the next step afterwards. So I did do workshops in iconography. I had the benefit of great advice from one of the world's greatest living iconographers, who I'd say Aidan Hart is. At the same time, I was given the opportunity to go and study in Florence for a year. I went to an atelier, as they call it, a workshop that teaches a rigorous method of naturalistic drawing and painting called the academic method, which dates from the period of the High Renaissance. And so I spent a year in Florence. And through this, I learned not only something about these two traditions, but I was observing how art is taught and how you learn a style in art. So I wasn't just learning from the teachers how to paint. I was learning how to teach painting because I wanted to follow a particular style and teach myself. And that was neither iconography at that time nor naturalistic styles. It was the Gothic. And I didn't know anybody who taught Gothic art. And that's still my goal, by the way. I still feel that at some point I'll come back to it and I'll do the Gothic style. So,
Right.
so that was the process. And so I learned to teach myself through these people.
That's fascinating. So taking the first step, going to your local art school, a teacher guides you to the next step, and then you take some bigger steps. Well, my journey to get to this topic, where I actually interview an iconographer like you, was that I also followed an intuition in a way that I've been teaching seminars on liberal arts education for the past 5 years. And I took students to a monastery in England, Ampleforth Monastery.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't have any lectures on beauty, but I did have some readings on the monastic view of education, where the built environment, the architecture, the layout of the school was meant to induce creativity, fellowship, and a sense of reverence and awe towards study. And what I learned from that in observing students was that they intuitively responded to this beautiful setting we were in. So then I began to read about beauty in education, and I came across quite a bit of philosophy and theology that spoke about beauty. Thomas Aquinas said a few things about beauty. There's Hans von Balthasar, it's difficult to say his name, excuse me, David Bentley Hart, an Orthodox theologian, talking about sacred art. I came across Roger Scruton talking about philosophy of art, aesthetics, Dietrich von Hildebrand. And then when I came to your blog and to your book, it was actually the first time that I had read a book about philosophy, theology, and art history that was not written by someone whose primary training was in an academic field, but someone who was a painter. So can you explain why you, as a painter, someone whose vocation it is to make art, why did you write a book about, essentially about the history of art?
Yes. So in the process of this, of learning, I wanted to serve the church as a Catholic. And I just to sort of go back, I actually began looking up Catholic art schools under C in the London telephone directory. I mean, I just thought, where do I begin? Because it didn't exist. But I really couldn't find anywhere that seemed to be focusing on art that would serve the church in a way that I could imagine learning. So what I wanted was to be immersed in a tradition, but able to create something, shall we say, that participates in those traditions in some way, but nevertheless is new and original and speaks to people today. The mark of tradition is that it reinvents itself with every generation without deviating from its core principles. We need new creators. We cannot rest on our laurels. The creators must study the past, but the culture, it's the culture of the present that we need to draw people into the church. That's the huge vacuum that we have at the moment. And so I was trying to work out how to do this. Part of this was going to these different teachers, but gradually it dawned on me that I'd probably have to found the school. And then I thought what I'd do is enlist as its first student. And then I needed to understand the practical ways that you learn, and then also the theory behind it, because even if I knew how to handle egg tempera, or I knew how to draw in charcoal or oil, the practical question that the artist has is, okay, I've got my brush on the canvas. Does that brush go left or right? And discussions on the philosophical nature of aesthetics doesn't tell me anything about that at all. It's hopeless. So I wanted to be able to answer those questions. And gradually it dawned on me that there was no person who could head this school. And there may be people there, just that I wasn't meeting them. And I realized that that going on the principle, as Cheston said, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. I just felt I could do at least as badly as anybody else in trying to found a school and create this. So I started to write and develop these ideas, all directed to forming artists. And then I realized that I had to apply this education to myself first and then become the teacher. And as I say, on the principle that I was at least as bad as anybody else out there. I couldn't see that I could do any worse. And that was really it. And I just carried on as far as the journey took me.
Well, this is fascinating. Okay, so I want you to unpack this a little bit for us. You say in your book, The Way of Beauty, which I recommend everybody listening to this, listening live, as well as listening to the recording. I know that there's some watch groups going on. There's groups of people watching this. I know I heard from a few teachers that this video is going to be part of faculty development for groups of teachers. So read this book, The Way of Beauty. But let me just give you a taste of what you'll find in that book. You say that the modern scientist describes the order of the universe mathematically. Nothing controversial there. Most people would accept that. But then you say the artist describes the world visually in conformity to those same mathematical laws, but their conformity is reproduced intuitively. What strikes me about this quote, and it was what really struck me about your book, is that having done all of this reading on the theology and philosophy of aesthetics, you lead your book talking about mathematics and geometry and bringing up sources that I had not encountered in my readings on art. Sources like Vitruvius, Boethius, and the Franciscan Bonaventure. So can you explain to us why you chose to emphasize so much the mathematical basis of painting?
In order to understand what beauty is, so I did do some theoretical reading, as you said. One of the key things that came out was that you have to look at the painting as a whole, and it's the whole has to be in conformity with, or you might say in harmony with, its overall purpose. So that you're designing something which has a purpose. Within that, all the parts within it have to work together so that the whole, in a sense, you might say, is greater than the sum of the parts. They work together so that the whole conforms to that purpose. And that principle is called due proportion. Proportion, each part is in relation to the others in such a way that the whole does the job that it's meant to do. And due proportion, people would talk about that, but actually the ancients understood this as actually having a mathematical basis. They worked with principles such as music, where they could hear that there is a sort of commonality in the way that people hear that certain notes sound good together. And it's pretty much universal. It goes across all cultures, the perfect fifth or the octave. People, not until they get to music school and it's trained out of them, will people stop hearing this, I would say. But people hear these things and they delight. And it's possible, even as going back as far as Pythagoras, to describe musical harmony numerically. It's interesting that even as I was sort of joking about the music school there and saying it's trained out of you, even they start with basic music theory on the assumption that everybody can hear that notes that are an octave apart, one is higher than the other, yet they sound the same. That C is related in some way to C an octave higher. There's no real explanation as to why those two are connected. It's a human perception, but it's universal, and we delight in it. And from that observation, what would happen is that people would then analyze that mathematically, going right the way back to Pythagoras, the length of pipes, for example, that produce these notes. The modern scientists will look at the frequencies of the wave of the sound, or the wavelength of the sound, and you find these mathematical relationships and that relate one sound to the other. The assumption then is that one of the special properties of number is that it can be abstracted from the thing that we're observing. So if I have 7 apples in a row, I can count 7 apples, but then I can, in my mind, abstract the idea of the number 7 and then use it to count 7 pears, for example, or 7 oranges. I draw the principle of 7 out of the thing that I observe and apply it to something else. So having observed these mathematical relationships that in certain areas, and music is the one where that opens the door particularly, I would say, to numerical analysis, people then apply it to time and space in other ways. So you can, for example, if the octave has the ratio of wavelengths that make those notes 1 to 2, what I would do is design a painting. I did a painting of Saint Michael the Archangel, and I made the external dimensions 1 to 2. So this was a big panel that went in the chapel at Thomas More College, and it was 3 feet by 6 feet. You then have within it, and Aidan Hart used to talk about this when he talked about designing paintings. You have within that boundary what he called resonant points. He felt that there were areas where the eye would naturally move to that seem balanced in relation to the edge. And so, for example, you can subdivide then the painting in the relation 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 or 3 to 4. And where that grid, those points, those lines cross horizontally and vertically, he would say they're resonant points in the composition. And so you do your best to make major themes in a composition coincide with those. Now, some people would say this is a restriction. I remember I used to talk about this when I was in Florence doing the portrait painting. They say, but this is going to restrict my creativity. Even though they're learning this traditional form, they had this romantic notion, and that's romantic with a capital R, that everything has to just come from within. Now, what I would say is that that's part of it. You use your intuition, you do look at things, but you can structure things initially and plan. When you then develop the composition, you do ask yourself the question, does this look good? The moment that you introduce objects into a painting, you perceive them in relation to each other in a particular way that can change. And so always you're modifying things slightly, you're moving things, because you ask yourself the question, is this beautiful? And it's not a rigid application, it's a modification from that broad skeleton, if you like, that broad foundation. And that's the way that artists work. It's the way that Aidan Hart taught me to work when I was studying iconography with him. And you can use it in all aspects of art.
This is absolutely fascinating. Again, I can't encourage readers enough to get this book, The Way of Beauty, because it will change how you see the world. It happened to me because in reading this description and seeing some of the images that explain what Professor Clayton has just said, I suddenly began to notice this, right? So you began talking about this concept of harmonious proportion. It had never dawned on me that ancient writers looked at the tonality of music, something we hear and impacts us in a certain way, and from that abstracted to proportions that would look good in something that we build, right? That there's this kind of parallelism between the harmony of music and the harmony of a building. It had never occurred to me, but I live in a tourist town. It's called Princeton, New Jersey. And why do people flock to Princeton's campus? Because they simply take delight in the buildings with their arches, their windows. And I always knew it was beautiful for some reason, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And also, as you say in your book, this idea that beauty is objective and there are certain things that we intuitively are drawn to. People come to campus and they literally just stare at the buildings. Now, when I was a graduate student, I lived in graduate housing, which was called Butler Apartments, and it had been built as temporary housing for soldiers coming back in World War II. So around 1945, it had been built, and I was living in it in like 2005. And guess what? It hadn't really been renovated, and it was temporary housing. It was basically a graduate student trailer park. Now, we constructed a beautiful life in the yard and the volleyball court and barbecues, but nobody would walk to that neighborhood to stare at the homes. They were perfectly functional. Well, maybe not even that, but they weren't beautiful. And so the point you're making, it is actually a little controversial to say that beauty is objective. But as you say in your book, you simply put certain images in front of people and it creates this resonance. So you said that as a painter, you have to think about, well, obviously you have to think about what you're going to paint and how you're going to paint. So you think about these terms that come from mathematics or music, harmonious proportion, you said. You said looking at the whole, which is what Aquinas calls integritas as a component of beauty. Yep. And you also said in the beginning, what are you trying to depict? So claritas, right? The idea that the painting is supposed to communicate a message to you. So I think the reason that I didn't find what you're talking about in most books is two reasons. One, because the books I was reading weren't written by painters. And two, because most art schools would not adopt this view that there's a mathematical basis to art. Is that correct?
Yes. And most art schools it's not that they're, I mean, many are ignorant of it, but at a certain point in the past, around the turn of the 20th century, so early 1900s, they consciously rejected the idea because they were anti-Christian. They knew they were rejecting the traditional view. They wanted to eliminate it, and so began throwing it out of art schools and architecture schools. But I should say that music is just one of those sources. There are other aspects. The proportions of idealized man, for example, were used. That's what Vitruvius used. And then also Boethius looks at patterns of symmetry within mathematics itself. Certain numerical relationships and symmetries. It's very hard to explain without showing you the numbers, but there are other ways in which people looked for these relationships.
Right.
Architecture is a great example to demonstrate this, because it's more easy to see it in the abstract, because you have, we went around Princeton one day, and you can see the distinction between the modern building, which has either every story exactly the same size, just repeated windows going up, which I would say is monotony. That's like an orchestra, every instrument in the orchestra playing the same note. Or you have utterly random proportions, which is like cacophony. Every instrument in the orchestra tuning away from us. The violinist plays the note, and every instrument makes sure they're not in tune with it, and then plays. Or you have harmony, in which you have different sized stories, for example. So the bottom window is large, the second one is slightly smaller, the third is smaller still, but there's this sense of a sort of progression in which the first relates to the second as the second relates to the third. That is harmony. And architects understood this until about the Second World War, when the ethos was such that they rejected it pretty much universally, I would say.
Well, I want to bridge into your writings on how this applies to education. But to make that bridge, I would say part of the reason what you wrote resonated with me is that one of the sources you talk about is an architect named Andrea Palladio, who was designing homes and villas in Italy, and probably I want to say around the 15th century. And maybe this is an image that our listeners can call upon. The Palladian Design is what is in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home now on the campus of the University of Virginia. But I did a trip to Italy on engineering and innovation, and we looked at 2,000 years of innovation and structures in Italy. And as you describe in your book, Palladio left behind his actual mathematical designs for his buildings. And just to make the point that these designs you're describing don't have to be in Monticello or in Princeton's campus. These proportions, Palladio applied them to smaller homes, right? So the idea is simply that in the modern world, it's not that they got rid of the proportions because, oh, that's only for the elite. It's because they simply didn't believe in it anymore. And you make this point very forcefully in your book, that modern art schools are actually anti-tradition. And what they're teaching is something called originality or self-expression or sincerity, but they've gotten rid of integritas and claritas and harmonious proportion, and that there's been a cost to our life in common by getting rid of this. But then you go on to say, as you've said in our discussion here already, that by tradition, you don't mean simply copying things from the past, right? But we do learn from masters, and maybe copying may be a step in the training of the artist, but you very much want to bring out the creativity of the artist, right? So you want this development of a natural and personal response to beauty that's present in creation, and that we do have intuition. So can you explain a little bit for our listeners how you understand the interplay between tradition and copying of great works and the intuition of the artist, with the goal of bringing these old forms of painting into the modern context?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll focus on then in response to that is the need for imitation in order to transmit style. So it was always the case in the past that artists learned by copying accepted masters in that tradition. So it does require a consensus about a canon of art and a reverence for great artists of the past. The creators need that. Even if the people in the present don't appreciate Shakespeare, for example, great writers probably need to do so if they're going to emulate his impact in his day, if they're going to emulate that today, I would suggest. And so in the context of painting, you do copy. And so going again to my iconography lessons, this is where Adenhart was so great. He would tell us why he was telling us to do something. So he'd say, right, we copy, but he'd say we copy with understanding. We try to understand why the artist has done it this way. And sometimes you would look at what the master had done and then say, well, he didn't do this very well, so I'm not going to copy his mistakes. And even the great iconographers would do things badly. I remember I learned this lesson when I copied an 11th century icon. I found the picture in the book from Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery, a famous icon of St. Matthew. And the hands kind of look distorted and not natural. And so I remember I thought, well, this is a great iconographer, I've done it. And I could see that the fingers didn't look right. And so Aidan looked at it and said, this is, he was very complimentary. He did a good job here. But why did he do the hand like that? And I said, well, I just copied what he did. So well, you don't copy the mistakes. That hand's done badly. So he would always say, copy with understanding. And then at the same time, you do need to learn to draw and paint from your direct observation of nature. And that then becomes your personal response to God's creation. And what happens is that in time, your natural style becomes a combination of your personal response and the style of the tradition. You develop an understanding by which you work in a way that conforms to the essential elements of the tradition, but apply those principles in a way that is personal to you. And the reason that this is so important is that as a member of 20th, 21st century society, if I do that, I'm more likely to connect with other people today in what I do. That's why we always need creators. So just to illustrate what this principle of imitation, if I wanted to paint or draw the human figure in the style of Marvel comics, Spider-Man and Batman, or I don't know if they're Marvel or the other one, but superheroes, I would copy the comics, the figures, and I would do life drawing classes. And in time, what would happen is when I painted or drew the figure I observed, it would naturally come in the style of a Marvel comic. That would become my own style. But it would be individual too. And Aidan used to say that someone who knows iconography can recognize to within about 50 years when it was painted by just looking at an icon, and also the geographical region that it comes from. That people reflect the society that they're parts of. Even the most cloistered monk cannot help but be in connection with the society of his day.
Well, okay, here's what I hear you saying, right? You say it in your book that you're aiming for humbled and inspired creativity in artists. You say that you want people to combine tradition and intuition, but I think what you just said leads into the next question I was going to ask you. But what I heard you saying is that we're embodied creatures. So we can't simply copy an art form from the past, because that would imply that somehow we're not affected by what we see around us. So when you said we look at nature, we look at Marvel comics, well, the creativity of the artist simply will be shaped by the cultural influences around him. Because we're incarnational beings, we can't avoid that. So it's actually not possible to purely copy something from the past, because we don't live in the past, we live today. I don't live in 15th century Italy. I live in Princeton in 2021. But and that's where so then I wanted to ask you then kind of why, if your vocation in life is to be a painter, why do you spend so much time writing books and teaching classes? Because in the way of beauty, you're making this argument, right? That one might think that a painter, to be a good painter, is essentially a hermit. That either you're just copying the traditional form of art, or you become a hermit and you're simply inspired by creativity mysteriously somehow and produce beautiful art. And you're saying neither of those is the case. You're saying that there's a dialogue between contemporary culture and the expressions of art. And I think what you're saying in the book is that painters, such as yourself, thrive in being embodied beings who are interacting with a community of learners, and that learning about art and learning to make art, this is the real challenge I want to give you in the question. You say multiple times that everybody is called to, in some way or another, create something in the culture. So basically my question is a big one here. How do you see the connection between art, education, and culture?
Okay, so the driving factor. So how are we all called to contribute to the culture? By being part of it. Every single one of us, even if we're not creating art or music or architecture, the things that we tend to think of as the aspects of high culture, culture is the pattern of living that is discernible when we look at a society as a whole. And so each of us contributes to that pattern of living. It may be encapsulated in a particular way in a work of art or in architecture that may somehow act as a prism that sort of illuminates in some way what that pattern is. But each of us contributes to the culture that collectively then influences what each of us do. So we're both cause and effect in a sense. We contribute to it, and it in turn influences us. Now, this is a self-contained circle of events, a cause and effect. That the force from outside that gives it life, so it doesn't wither on the vine, is grace and faith in God. And the wellspring of Christian culture is the liturgy and the worship of God. That is the contact point where we look outside and beyond ourselves individually and as a society, in effect, through that. And God's grace comes in and breathes life into that culture. And the liturgy is the source of its own culture. So people talk a lot about how Western culture, this is cultural imperialism. First of all, Western culture, as many people refer to it, is Christian culture. It didn't begin in Europe. It began in the Middle East, began with Christianity. But it is not intrinsically European. It reflects primarily Christianity. And to the degree that we want Christianity to be brought to all people, we want the culture that reflects it to do so. It might start off as the European manifestation of it, but then it will take root as the South American manifestation of it, for example. So that is what is going on. Now, what we need, therefore, is a formation in faith. And so important in the formation in faith are the art forms that affect us during our worship. That is the place of the encounter with the living God. Obviously, most directly in the Eucharist, in the Blessed Sacrament, Christ is really present, but all of our acts of worship which emanate from that and direct to that are consistent with it. And as you put it very beautifully earlier, as embodied beings, we interact via material things. And so there is music, there is architecture, there is art. And these objects can work so as to open us up and direct us to right worship, or they can distract us if it's done badly. That's why you tend to rely on tradition and the things that have come through to us. So the education, therefore, how does this affect our education? It's at its deepest level, it's about our formation as people and as Christians who then contribute to the culture. And so it begins with the forms that are connected to the liturgy. And then we go out and we just work and do what we do naturally, even if it's not artistic, and it will bear that pattern. That pattern of that we hope is divinely inspired of the art as we see impresses itself upon our hearts. Now, for those that are consciously creating aspects of what you might call high culture, so literature, art, architecture, music, they need to study this more carefully. So not only do they need to be faithful Christians participating in that dynamic in the way that I've just described, They need to understand how the art that is working in harmony with the liturgy, how the music and the architecture or the literary forms that are in the liturgy actually connect to us, direct us to God. Then, when they create their own contemporary culture, they will reflect those patterns in their own way. And so this is as much about studying intellectually, it does involve that, but it is as much about what you referred to, that phrase, mystagogical catechesis, that it is possible for people who have no faith to create beautiful things, but if you want to increase the chances of our society reflecting Christian values in a way that is particular to this time and this place, and therefore will draw others in, which really is about, that's what our whole mission as human beings is, then we need that formation, and that engages traditional culture so that we can create new culture and contemporary culture.
Well, I want to move into a little bit of time for Q&A with the audience. So let me just direct the audience. If you have questions for Professor Clayton, you can use the Q&A button. I love that we've got a chat going in the chat box, but maybe send in some questions on the Q&A. But while people do that, let me say that for listeners who are looking in your context, your university, your school, your home, your neighborhood, what's the very next step you can get to? Once again, let me encourage you to read the whole book, The Way of Beauty, because what we just heard from Professor Clayton, you could say, is his integral vision of what education could and really should be. But as you heard in his story, he came to this vision himself step by step. And so what I see when I talk to educators and directors of schools and teachers, I see resonating in your book and your big vision that a lot of schools are already putting pieces of this vision into place. Sometimes people hear me talk about Scala's vision of this unified understanding of the liberal arts with beauty and harmony and wisdom. And then people say, well, how can I do that in my school today? And what I want to give people is, yes, you need to study and understand this classical vision of the liberal arts and the place of beauty, because it's important to be able to defend and explain this model of education vis-a-vis models of education that are focusing on, for grade school to high school, college readiness. And in college, you're going to get ready for a career in finance or medicine. And look, there's nothing wrong with having skills that are going to help you be successful in medicine. But what you're producing, what you're arguing, is that human beings have a higher calling than whatever our function is in life. And so what you explain so beautifully in the book is that actually liberal arts education, the quadrivium and the trivium, that the quadrivium included arithmetic and geometry because it was understood as foundational to all of knowledge and preparing us to be able to perceive the harmonious order in nature. You also spent a good bit of time talking about the connection between the liberal arts and faith formation, although you yourself did not have that. You had an excellent education in many ways, but faith formation was not a part of it. So what I hear you describing is kind of what this vision of education ideally should look like. And you emphasize a lot the connection between the liberal arts, the subjects we study, and worship. So people today who are working in the classical liberal arts world, some of them are religious schools, but even if they're not, you can do a liberal arts education and acknowledge that people have an intrinsic desire for worship and leaving space for that. I know that my imagination, my education was shaped very much by the fact that not only did I go to a Catholic school, I went to a Catholic school in Frederick, Maryland that was next to a parish, and the building itself was beautiful. And we had instructions in worship and we participated in worship. And I think as a child that I was living what you call this mystagogical catechesis, this idea that what I was learning in school is also part of a larger life where I'm being transformed in the liturgy to become a new creation. So what I wanted to point out, and maybe this is my last question for you before we take questions from the audience, although now you have been on this journey to not only move from natural sciences into art, which, by the way, you also argue art is an expression of the mathematical truths of the sciences. You've moved on this journey to be a Catholic, but you weren't always there. So all of this big vision that you just described, is this a vision that is now saying, look, I found the answer, come join me in all of these ways? Or is it an invitation? I mean, how do you have this kind of holistic vision that you have while also presenting it to people who were like you yourself once were, someone who's not formed in faith, someone who doesn't think they're looking for this? How would you present this?
Well, you have to, it depends on the person that you're dealing with, clearly. So that the whole point of this is you deal with people and meet them where they are, and then lead them towards the hub, which is the Eucharist. So David did that with me. He didn't mention the faith or worship or religion or Christianity for years after I knew him. So one of the things that I did was, in terms of engaging with people individually, let's imagine that we are formed as Christians sufficiently. We're all imperfect. We all just do our best. But that we hope that we, through our actions and the way we are, we demonstrate some aspect of joy, the joy of living, and love of neighbor, and the beauty in our actions, or grace, if you like, just in what we do, that draws people to us. People might say, what do you have? Very often this can occur in conversations where people might open up and describe difficulties that they're having. That can happen. And so there's that trust. But that's really what David did with me. And then he said, well, what are you looking for? Would you like, he offered me this mentorship. He said, I can help you here. And so the book that I wrote, The Vision for You, describes very precisely the process that he took me through, and also the way that he engaged me as a cynical non-Christian. So that is available to people. It works very well with Catholics. So since I've published this book, many people have approached me who are in the faith and feel that they'd like to discern their personal vocation, for example, and it seems to work to great effect. One of the great things about this, by the way, is that once you go through it, you're then in a position to show others, and that becomes a great joy in mentoring others. And so since that book was published 4 or 5 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we're now into the 3rd, 4th, 5th generation of people, if you like, who are helping others to discern their vocation. Now, all of this presupposes, so what attracted me to David? He was a Catholic. He was living his faith, not perfectly. In some ways, he started to go to Mass more regularly when I started to go, and he came along with me. But he was a godly man. He was a believer. He certainly believed in many ways in what the faith had taught him. And I just saw something about him that I wanted. Now, what can you do in education to try and encourage this? I would say, as well as studying the disciplines of the liberal arts and Catholic tradition and the Catholic faith, all of these things are part of this. They can be taught. The way to encourage people to be able to integrate this into their lives and accept it in their hearts is to encourage people to worship and pray well. And the most obvious way in a school, for example, that I think this could be done is through the liturgy of the hours and the Mass, of course, but especially the liturgy of the hours, if that isn't being done. the Psalms, chanting the Psalms in conjunction with religious imagery that contains the essence of salvation history. For example, there are certain images, I explain this in the little oratory, will not only prepare us for that encounter with Christ in the Mass, but it's it's through these material forms. They shape us in such a way that we start to conform inwardly to that harmony, and it begins to shine out of us, shall we say, despite ourselves. And it is that so many Catholic institutions don't seem to be aware of, it seems to me. One of the reasons I wrote The Way of Beauty was it was not to be critical of them, is to say there needs to be some understanding of how the academic disciplines directly contribute to our worship of God. And then we need to be teaching people to worship well. So I'm not talking about the liberal places where they're not interested in the faith. I mean, they're beyond the pale. We can put those to one side. The places that are genuinely Catholic and Christian, that connection with the worship and how, for example, the patterns of the cosmos relate to the patterns of worship. This can be pointed out. And when people are worshipping well, they are actually impressing upon their souls the very pattern of divinity, in a sense, that shines through the cosmos, reaches out to us from the liturgy, and it transforms us. Now, you can't guarantee that. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But we can do a little bit more to encourage that and that transformation in Christ, I think, through Catholic education that can turn us into a David Birtwistle.
Well, what I hear you saying, based on your own experience with David Birtwistle, is that to present this holistic vision, it really begins through a relationship that's a companionship. And David was your companion for many years, and he led you on this path little by little, right? And what I heard you saying was that if we've studied this model of education, if we ourselves know how to appreciate beauty, know how to appreciate liturgy, know how to pray, then these are specific concrete practices that we can little by little invite people into. And that in a way, the real factor is the witness of a joyful life. You describing yourself as somebody who's seeking a more meaningful life and not knowing where to find it. And so what I hear you saying is a kind of this model of education, this kind of transformation of oneself, this constant seeking to transform oneself and to imbibe culture and liturgy spills over into our relationships. So don't be afraid, let's say, to share the faith through a conversation, through an invitation liturgy, through art, and see how the person responds, and then go to the next step. But now, to move into some questions from the from the audience. I slipped and I said the artists, because we do have many artists listening. And the artists have these questions where they want to know some practical steps, right? Some practical things about how does one, as an artist or an aspiring artist, achieve the kind of training that they desire, and also what kind of a spirituality is there for artists. So can I maybe rope two audience questions together, which is one coming in from Chiara, who's a theology student, but really wants to be a painter. So should she just go to the local community art school? And then Catherine, also listening, asks, well, what's the role of prayer in for example, Russian iconographers? And so how do we actually integrate the making of art with the spiritual life?
Okay, so the practical steps, if you want to be an artist, I mean, you need to understand the tradition. So a lot of that is in the book, The Way of Beauty, or the Master of Sacred Arts program is actually designed to communicate that. as well as that, that you need to learn the skills of the artist. Now, you can learn that in any context, but if you don't just sign up to the local art school, make sure it is one that teaches drawing and painting. The other thing I would do is think very deeply about what sort of art appeals to you most. If you like naturalistic styles, try to go for authentic Christian styles. So that would be the Baroque style. And at least have a view that if you're learning the academic method, as they call it, these ateliers exist now all over the US, that you're not going to get a degree learning this because it hasn't moved into the mainstream. But there are many ateliers around, even in Oakland, there's one, people teaching this method now. They've mushroomed, really. So you can learn this, but be aware that you need that formation. Once you've got the skill, you need to immerse yourself in the tradition. So imitate the masters you like. You need to study the principles of harmonious proportion and sacred number. You need a formation in faith, and then start to think about what you want to do with the art. Do you want to, it's all directed by a purpose which is consistent with a Christian life. So if you want to paint in churches, that's great. If you want to do portrait painting, then do that. As a Christian, you would seek out something that gave you that sort of training. So you're going to have to pull together these various strands. It's a little easier now than it was for me, because I've tried to capture as much of these ideas as I can. So if you're prepared to take my view of it, go to Pontifex University, do the Master of Sacred Arts, or at least some of those courses, or read my books. Now, with regard, just get a plug in there. I see you laughing. Yeah, I see. With regard to the prayer, one of the things about iconography, people always, first of all, they talk about painting as a prayer. You've got to pray beforehand and all this sort of thing. Okay, there's a lot of mystique, particularly around iconography, that was kind of manufactured in the middle of the 20th century in order to differentiate it by the Orthodox people who were re-establishing the iconographic tradition, which they did very successfully in the middle of the 20th century, but they wanted to differentiate it from the Western forms. So they attached a sort of mystique to it. And so a lot of what you hear when you go to an icon painting class is not actual sort of the words of the Church Fathers. It's these people in the middle of the 20th century asking themselves the question, how can we teach people to paint in this tradition? And they did this very well, so that we're now in the situation where many people always assume that the iconographic tradition just carried on unbroken through centuries. It's not true at all. It declined and then was re-established. But with regard to prayer, the answer is yes. If you want inspiration from God, you must pray. But there are no special prayers for iconographers. Do I fast? Yes, I fast. But I fast and pray because I'm a Catholic. I do these things as part of the Christian life. And then I'll be open to inspiration, not only as an artist, but anything else I do. God is offering grace, shall we say, every moment of the day. And my inclination to follow it is enhanced through prayer and fasting and the rest of the Christian life. So I would say don't get too caught up in special formula of prayers, for example. I'm not against that. But at least have this sense that this is what Christians ought to be doing. And regardless of what your personal vocation is, that includes art, but it means everything else as well. So it's not just iconographers who need to pray before they work, it's accountants and doctors and everybody else, construction workers.
Thank you.
Teachers.
That's great. I mean, listen, I would just say we're going to bridge into a few more questions before we close in a few more minutes. But what I hear you saying in response to the questions is that, well, so first of all, it is important to know that there are local art programs that could be good for you, but do take advantage of Pontifex's programs. I mean, there is a master's in sacred arts. You've developed these courses. There's some cost associated with it, but as an online program, your goal was to make this training, at least in the history of art, but you teach on techniques of art as well. So these courses for the aspiring artists listening, they are available, and it's important for people to know that. This larger question about the integration of art, prayer, education is going to be actually the subject of Scala's conference in the spring, at which you will be speaking, as well as James Matthew Wilson, who's a poet and a philosopher. And so Scala wants to create a hub, particularly for these kinds of conversations. How do we bring together culture creators with educators, with students, and with the general public that's listening to this talk? Because part of being a fulfilled human being, part of leading a joyful, happy life is knowing about beauty, right? This is another question that we got from the audience. Like, how does beauty matter, for example, to somebody who's studying history, right? And I would say that beauty matters for every subject. What we've ended up with is that beauty has itself become a specialized subject rather than something as fundamental to the human being as happiness. We all believe happiness is part of who we are as human beings. Why don't we think beauty matters? And so I would say that my own creativity, I'm not an artist, I'm not a painter, but my own creativity during COVID has been sparked, and I've done more gardening than I've done before. I'm encountering the natural world.
Yeah.
I've done more cooking because we're all staying at home more. That's a way of encountering nature. And I've nurtured my own intuitive desire to be on a small scale, a culture creator. So if I could just ask you a couple more questions that have come in before we wind down. I mean, I've already alluded to one. Why does beauty matter across the curriculum? And this is coming in particular from an historian, right? Is it just that a historian wants to know about beauty so they write more beautiful prose? Or is beauty somehow fundamental to the study of history? And then kind of another related question is just to go a little bit deeper into your comments about the differences between classical and contemporary or modern art. So for example, classical Islamic art, that's highly mathematical. How is that similar to or different than Christians who create beautiful art? Because as another viewer said, how does this, what you've said, apply across cultures that maybe aren't Christian culture? So those are really actually two different questions.
All right. So you're asking me, is there a place for consideration of beauty in history?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess this comes down to the question as to why history is worth knowing. And I mean, the short answer is yes. You'd expect me to say that, I think. But why is history worth knowing? Well, my view, which I'm guessing is fairly conventional for a Christian, is that we need to have a sense of ourselves as people, and we need to have a sense of ourselves in relation to the society and culture that we're part of. And so that, therefore, means that we need to understand the history, what formed us so that we are as we are now. But in the end, that has to be connected to a theory of history, which for Christians is salvation history. If you're a Marxist, it's Marxist theory. So, they will teach history with a view to bringing down current society in every way they can. So they understand the importance of history. It's a shame sometimes that Christians don't. And or don't resist, shall we say, the Marxist version of history more strongly, which and this does have relevance to art. The place where the Marxist theories and their derivations, the modern manifestations of them, such as critical theory, for example, where the place where they're most virulent is in art departments, English departments. It's in the humanities and the arts, and because they understand that you manifest and encapsulate the values of a society in art and the works of culture. As I said, you're embodying the pattern of the culture. And so we cannot do that if we don't understand deeply what a Christian culture is, what Christian society is. And that means, therefore, relating it to the understanding at its root, we're on a trajectory which is salvation history, and relating that to it. Beauty is the thing that draws us into it. You don't. People will not read and accept if they don't want to, if they're not drawn to it. And so, not only must we highlight how people have drawn people into the faith in the past by looking, as well as looking at the sort of history of art and relating that to general history, even history itself must be taught beautifully. It permeates everything, because otherwise people won't listen. They won't want to hear what we have to say. So the very act of us talking now, we want to do this in a way that is appealing, engaging to ordinary people. Noble accessibility is the principle here. It needs to be taking us to a high place, but meeting us where we are, not just for the elites.
Now that you say that, one of my neighbors here in Princeton is the historian Peter Brown. He's an historian of the ancient world. He writes about really the first 4 centuries of Christianity. He's famous for his biography of Augustine, who converted to Christianity, of course. And I said to him recently, Peter, I've been reading on beauty, and it was really important in the ancient world. And he said, no, it was everything. So I think what he meant by that comment was similar to what you just said. Modern history, I'm paraphrasing here broadly, making a broad generalization. The underlying assumption is that history is moved by material forces of one kind or another: wealth, power, domination, conflict, war, politics. This is what historians should study. And what I think Peter Brown was saying to me was that ancient civilizations really cared about the pursuit of beauty, about the construction of beauty. Plato wrote about this, Aristotle wrote about this. It would have been second nature in ancient Greece or Rome to intrinsically care about the built order. And they spent a lot of time discussing and thinking about beauty and creating beautiful things because they took it for granted this is part of who we are as human beings. And in the modern world, we've almost equated beauty as epiphenomenal, as secondary, as something for people who have the time off of manual labor to contemplate beauty. And that's not at all what we've been saying in this. We've been saying that beauty is actually fundamental to who we are as human beings, and that cultures strive, or cultures organize themselves around particular understandings of beauty and particular depictions of it. Which now brings me to the question that I began to ask, and want to kind of restate it because 2 people have now asked this. To what extent is what you have said about beauty particular to a certain context? Call it the Christian context, call it the Western, or is what you're saying also applicable across cultures? Is this really universal? And specifically, one person asked about Islamic art, which shares some of the mathematical principles, but is not Christian art. But yet many Christians still find Islamic representations with geometry and math. They find that to be beautiful. So how universal is this view of beauty? And how particular is it to Christianity when these same mathematical formulas reappear in other traditions of art, such as Islamic art?
Well, is it universal? I would say that it appeals universally. So it touches people not from all cultures and draws them towards itself and ultimately to God. That would be the Christian understanding. And just as other cultures can discern without revelation, shall we say, some of the truths of the faith. So the very obvious one is the pre-Christian Greek philosophers, that then by natural means, they discern things that point to God. That can work in art and music and other aspects of the culture as well. Islamic art is something that I discuss in depth, particularly because it's the one area in geometric patterned art that's still living just about today. And so as Christians, that's probably where we're going to have to look if we want to be practitioners. The Christians have always done this. They look for what is good. We don't need to adopt wholesale their symbolism of number that Islam uses, but we can recognize that if an octagonal pattern is beautiful, and we can imbue it with the Christian interpretation that the number 8 is significant of Christ, the 8th day, for example. And you see, and this has been done in the past. So you see Bibles produced in the Middle East in the 15th century, which was under Islamic rule, with octagonal designs on the front and Arabic script, doing just that. Similarly, if you look at the periods in the past where Islam and Christianity has met, when the Normans reconquered or conquered southern Italy and especially Sicily, around 1000 AD and the period after that, they went on a building program, and there were Byzantine, Islamic, Byzantine Christian, Islamic artists, and then Roman Catholics there as well. And you see this fusion of all of these directed towards a Christian purpose. So we really must look at everything. And I actually discovered a lot of these ideas of sacred number and harmony by meeting Islamic artists in London who were producing this sort of art. And they were universalists as well. So I don't know how true to Islam they were, but they believed that this had universal appeal, and they were actually sort of slightly outside their own religion, and that they believed that religions were different expressions of a sort of secret inner truth or something, which I don't believe, and I don't think Islamic people believe. But nevertheless, we can always look at other cultures and draw in what is good, as long as we do so discerningly. I just make one point about Islam. A lot of Islamic culture is a development from Byzantine culture. So Islamic music, the musical structures, those patterns existed in Byzantine art prior to conquest by Islamic forces. They developed it for themselves and put onto it, took it further in their own cultures, and produced something wonderful by it. So just as the Islam were the custodians of the Greek philosophers, you might say they've been the custodians of much Christian forms as well. They've developed it in their own way, and we can engage with it and happily take back what we like, I would say, and say, thank you very much. This is wonderful.
Well, with that, we are going to have to wind down, but I will just repeat what I hear you saying, and you've been saying in this wonderful conversation, and you say it very clearly in your book, that we can identify universal principles of beauty and techniques of beauty while also upholding the creativity of the artist and the impact of the local culture. And what I heard you saying about the cross-cultural dialogue, and I think a previous person I spoke to on this series, Makoto Fujimura, he's a painter from Japan, and he spoke very specifically to the intersection of Christian faith with Japanese culture, which does not have a lot of people of faith. And he actually sees art as a potential for opening up this cross-cultural dialogue. So what I hear you saying is that you can argue that there are universal principles of art and beauty, while also acknowledge that particular cultures, particular faiths express it in ways, and that actually believing that there's something universal can allow for this cross-cultural dialogue, while also saying, well, but that part is going to be particular to this culture or this time, but here's what's universal about it that we can all see. So rather than thinking that universal principles mean we can't have cross-cultural dialogue, if you say, well, we have universal principles and there are particulars to the particular artist and to the particular culture, you can see both.
Yeah, I just make a point very quickly that some of those particulars can be adopted as well. I mean, we can look at that and say, that's great, that they are absolutely consistent with Christianity, and we would never have never have thought of that if we hadn't had contact with these non-Christians.
Well, I want to conclude with a quote from one of the concluding sentences of your book, and then I really will end this webinar, which is so engaging. You say in The Way of Beauty, and I'm quoting you here, "Our culture must be a culture of beauty that inspires man, and calls him into motion right at the start of our journey. We must all contribute to the creation and maintenance of a culture of beauty by cooperating with God's grace so that it permeates all that we do. We must strive to make our lives joyful and replete with images and reflections that call and direct others to their home. Our work must bear the beauty that pierces the hearts of those who see it. I want to end on that note of inspiration from you and thank Professor Clayton for his wonderful work, for his time today. Encourage you to follow his blog, The Way of Beauty, to look at his courses at Pontifex, and to just briefly point back to the mission of Scala Foundation, which is to revitalize culture through liberal arts education with a strong emphasis on beauty. And as one of our participants put in the chat, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his statement, "Beauty will save the world." It is very easy right now to look at the chaos of the world and the disorder and the fragmentation and get caught up in negativity. But what I see in your final quote is that the ethos of what you do as a painter and as an educator and as a speaker is to share with people your calling as an artist, your calling as a person of faith, but to make this plea that we all are incarnated beings and we're all called in one way or another to be culture creators, to be preservers of tradition, and by the way that we live our lives, to inspire others into motion on this wonderful journey that you have been on as an artist and as a person of faith. And if we do that with sincerity, we will pierce the hearts of people who are looking right now for a reason to hope. So thank you for your time. Thank you to everybody for being here. Please check out Scala Foundation's website, our YouTube channel, and the Way of Beauty blog, and order some books by Professor Clayton, and hope to see all of you at Princeton's April 29, 30, 2022 conference on beauty. Thank you.
Thank you.